The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above Cedar Creek Medical's ICU corridor, a sound Ashley Cooper had stopped hearing somewhere around year 3. She moved through the hallway like a shadow moves across a wall, present, inevitable, unremarkable. Her scrubs were pressed sharp enough to cut, her badge clipped precisely at sternum level, her dark hair pulled back so tightly that no single strand dared escape. She didn't walk into rooms. She materialized in them. Vital signs, medication checks, for adjustments. Out. The kind of nurse other nurses forgot about before she cleared the doorway. Dr. Richard Pierce stood at the nurse's station reviewing charts, his reading glasses perched on a nose that had never known a day's doubt. At 58, he moved through Cedar Creek Medical like a man accustomed to occupying the largest space in any room. His suit probably cost more than Ashley's car. Everything about him insisted on being noticed. Everything about her insisted on being ignored. When their eyes might have met near the supply closet, his slid right through her, the kind of way you look at equipment, at the oxygen tanks and 4 stands that kept his patients alive but required no acknowledgement from him. She was part of the infrastructure. Important the way a wall was important. Ashley reached room 447 and paused at the threshold, her hand steady on the door frame. Inside, Colonel Marcus Chen lay propped at a 45-degree angle, his cardiac monitors painting green slopes across the screen in rhythmic waves. He was 53, weathered by the kind of service that aged a man faster than physics allowed. Desert sun had carved lines into his face that no amount of moisturizer could smooth. But his eyes tracked to hers the moment she entered. Sharp. Alert. The eyes of a commanding officer who noticed everything. "Captain," he said, then stopped himself. Smiled. "Morning, nurse." The title hung between them like a secret, unspoken but understood. Ashley's jaw didn't move. Her training, the kind that lasted longer than most marriages, had taught her that information flowed one direction only, inward. She checked his blood pressure cuff, which read 138/82. Slightly elevated from yesterday's 134/79. She noted it on his chart. Noted also the slight tremor in his left hand where it rested on the blanket. Everything was data. Pain was information. Variations in vitals were stories written in numbers. "How's the pain?" she asked, her voice calibrated to the frequency of calm competence. Just enough warmth to be professional. Never enough to encourage conversation. "Manageable," he said. "Your son's unit is rotating into Kandahar next month. Did he tell you?" The question landed like a training round, the kind of unexpected fire that came from friendly territory. Ashley's hands continued their work, adjusting the foredrip, ensuring the line ran clear, checking the electrodes that mapped his heart's rhythm. Her hands belonged to her body's memory now, not her conscious mind. The conscious mind was 6,000 miles away with a man she'd given birth to 23 years ago and hadn't held since he was deployed. "He doesn't tell me much," she said. It was the truth. David's letters came infrequently, 12 to 15 lines written on military stationery, words chosen as carefully as someone navigating a minefield. But Colonel Marcus Chen held her son's life in the decisions he made every single day. Sent him into villages where the walls had eyes. Trusted him with equipment that kept people breathing. A man like that was not someone you wanted to anger. A man like that was someone you kept employed, grateful, present. "He's good," Marcus said. The word seemed to cost him something. Better than good. "He's careful. Respectful. The kind of soldier who understands that speed and precision aren't the same as recklessness." Ashley wanted to ask more. Wanted to ask if David had mentioned her, if he'd said anything beyond the perfunctory "my mother works at a hospital in Atlanta." Instead, she checked his oxygen saturation, 96%, excellent, and made a note. 8 more vital signs to check before her shift hit the second hour. 6 other patients who might need her. A hospital that ran on her invisibility. She was turning to leave when Marcus spoke again, his voice dropping. "Whatever you're carrying, nurse. Whatever it is that brings you to a place like this instead of somewhere else. I hope it eases up soon. Ashley paused at the doorway but didn't turn. Didn't let her shoulders betray the impact of words she wasn't supposed to understand. She had been trained to absorb hits without flinching. Had been trained by the finest military instructors in the continental United States to respond to threats with precisely calibrated force. But there was no training protocol for kindness delivered by the man holding your child's survival in his hands. She nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, and moved back into the corridor. The supply room occupied the ICU's northwest corner, climate-controlled and meticulously organized. Shelves held for solutions, dressing materials, diagnostic equipment, sutures in every gauge, and the specialized items that kept Cedar Creek's surgery department running: 14-gauge angiocath needles, sterile gloves in sizes from XS to XXL, endotracheal tubes sorted by diameter. Ashley had inventory rotation on Mondays, a task she volunteered for because it was solitary work, because the supply room existed at the edges of the hospital's social ecosystem, because numbers made more sense than people. She was counting the cardiac defibrillator pads, boxes of 4, packaging bearing the manufacturer's seal, lot numbers printed in precise black ink, when something caught her attention. The purchase orders were logged in the system via tablet mounted on the supply room wall. She'd never questioned them before. The forms came in, she received the shipments, she stocked the shelves. Someone else paid the bills. That was how systems worked. Hierarchy meant you didn't look too high or too low, you just looked at your own square of the board. But today, something in the numbers didn't align. The cardiac monitoring equipment orders showed charges of $4,847 per unit when the manufacturer's website listed them at $2,100. The surgical glove orders showed costs 3 times what her mother's clinic in Decatur paid for identical products. The four-solution pricing was inflated by a margin so obvious it seemed impossible no one had noticed. Ashley's mind, trained to absorb pattern recognition on battlefields where the wrong pattern meant death, suddenly saw the shape of something beneath the surface. Someone was running numbers through Cedar Creek's acquisition department that didn't match external reality. Someone had been doing it long enough that the discrepancy had become routine. She photographed the tablet screen with her personal phone, a habit from her previous life, photographing evidence, documenting anomalies, and saved the images to a secure folder encrypted with a password only she knew. $63,000 in overbilling across 3 months on surgical equipment alone. That wasn't error. That was intention. Ashley's hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. The training held. In the combat theater, intel gathering had been her specialty, the kind of work that required patience and precision, the kind of work that got people killed if you made it personal or emotional. This was different, this was wrong. This was embezzlement occurring inside a hospital that had hired her despite the fact that the Pentagon had told every institution in America she was a security risk. This hospital had given her invisibility, which meant safety. Which meant proximity to information about Colonel Marcus Chen's unit rotations. Which meant her son stayed as safe as a 23-year-old combat infantryman could possibly stay. She could not afford to lose this job. The supply room was silent except for the ventilation system's whisper, that mechanical breathing that never stopped, that kept the air clean and cold and stable. Ashley completed her inventory count. Documented the numbers accurately. Placed the tablet back on its wall mount. And walked out of the supply room at 7:34 a.m., the photographs of fraudulent billing records locked in her phone's encrypted vault, invisible as everything else about her. She didn't know that Dr. Pierce had been systematically inflating Cedar Creek Medical's surgical equipment costs for 3 years. Didn't know that the hospital's board had been too trusting to scrutinize his acquisition authority. Didn't know that a junior administrator named Helen Watts had noticed the same discrepancies 6 months ago and filed a concern with Pierce directly, only to find herself transferred to the night shift in pediatrics the following week. What she did know was that she'd just identified a problem, and that problems in institutions like this one didn't stay small. They grew. They metastasized. They consumed people who asked the wrong questions about the wrong people's money. That happened at 2:37 that afternoon, when Ashley walked past Dr. Pierce's office and found him on the phone, his voice tight with something that sounded like controlled fury. He was looking at his computer screen, at the same ordering system she'd accessed that morning, his face a careful mask of professional composure. He disconnected the call. He sat very still. And then he looked up just as Ashley passed his doorway, their eyes meeting for the first time in any meaningful way since she'd arrived at Cedar Creek Medical. Recognition flickered across his face. Not of her as a person, but as the person who had been in the supply room. The person who had access to the same records he was now reviewing. The person who, given the timeline, might have been the one to notice what he'd worked 3 years to perfect. His expression returned to neutral. But it was already too late. Dr. Pierce was waiting outside room for 47 when the Chen family arrived. He had timed it perfectly, the colonel's daughter and 2 adult sons moving through the ICU doors at shift change, when the hallway filled with visiting hours traffic and maximum witnesses. Ashley was checking the monitor displays, her attention on the steady rhythm of Colonel Chen's cardiac trace when Pierce's voice cut across the unit with surgical precision. "Nurse Cooper." Not a question. A summons delivered loud enough that 3 family members turned. "Explain these charting errors to the Chen family. Or are you too incompetent to understand basic documentation?" He held up her medication logs. Her perfectly accurate, meticulous medication logs from the previous 8 hours. Ashley's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She could see the logs from where she stood 15 feet away, every entry correct, every timestamp verified, every dosage notation in perfect alignment with the colonel's standing orders. Pierce pointed to blank space on the page as if indicating damning evidence. Ashley walked toward him. Her hands remained at her sides. Her voice, when she spoke, stayed level as a held note on a ventilator. "Those charts are correct, Doctor." The words hung in the air. A nurse disagreeing with a senior physician in front of family members. Pierce's smile turned into something that resembled a wolf showing its teeth, not an expression of warmth but a display of dominance. His eyes went cold. "Are you contradicting me, Invisible?" The nickname landed like a scalpel. Invisible. Not her name. Not even Nurse Cooper anymore. The colonel's daughter flinched. One of the sons shifted his weight. Ashley felt the weight of their attention, their discomfort, their sudden uncertainty about whether this quiet nurse beside their father's bed was competent or incompetent. Pierce had constructed the entire scene around that single moment, had chosen the time, the audience, the angle of attack. He was competent at this. Devastatingly competent. "No, Doctor." Ashley's face showed nothing. The military discipline that had carried her through 18 months in the Hindu Kush mountains without breaking held her steady now. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She simply nodded once and returned to the medication cart, continuing her rounds as if the exchange had never occurred. But it had occurred. The family had witnessed it. The doubt had been planted. The next afternoon, a fabricated write-up appeared on the unit board in the break room. 1 page, printed on hospital letterhead, Dr. Pierce's signature bold at the bottom. The document cited Nurse Ashley Cooper for insubordination and failure to follow protocol. It referenced an incident where she had contradicted physician directives in front of patients and families and demonstrated concerning judgment regarding patient safety documentation. The language was precise. Clinical. Impossible to immediately disprove without comparing the actual charts, which most nurses would never bother to do. Most nurses would simply read the write-up and absorb the message, "This nurse is problematic." Ashley read it once during her shift change. Her expression remained neutral, the mask of someone viewing a weather report, not a professional demolition. She had memorized her personnel file long ago, had known since her discharge from the Pentagon that appearances could be fabricated, records could be altered, reputations could be erased. This was merely a civilian version of operational security. Plausible deniability. Institutional protection. She did not remove the write-up. She did not post a rebuttal. She simply walked into the break room the following day for her lunch break. The room emptied within 60 seconds. For nurses suddenly remembered charting tasks that required immediate attention. 2 others checked their phones and discovered urgent messages requiring their presence elsewhere. A physical therapist who had been microwaving soup left the soup spinning unwashed in the microwave. The break room cleared with the coordination of a synchronized retreat, each departure timed to avoid the appearance of a coordinated departure. Pierce had sent a carefully worded email to the nursing staff about problematic staff members creating potential liability concerns and the importance of maintaining professional distance from individuals who may compromise unit cohesion. He had not named Ashley. He had not needed to. The effect was identical to naming her. Every nurse understood exactly who the email described. Ashley sat at the break room table with her sandwich and a bottle of water. She did not eat. Her eyes remained fixed on the table's laminate surface. The sandwich sat in front of her cooling, untouched, as if she had simply forgotten it was food. 42 minutes passed before her shift resumed. She disposed of the sandwich in the trash without opening it and returned to the floor. Colonel Chen was awake when she entered his room. He was a man accustomed to reading people. 31 years in uniform had taught him to observe the small tells that civilian life rarely noticed. He watched Ashley move through his room with the economy of motion that characterized Special Forces operators, watched her hands organize his medications with a precision that suggested muscle memory developed under conditions far more demanding than a hospital environment, watched her eyes track him with the assessment pattern of someone trained to process threat indicators. Rough shift, Nurse Cooper. His voice carried the weight of command, even weakened by cardiac trauma. Routine, Colonel. Her response was immediate, professional, without inflection. She did not add elaboration. She did not use the occasion to vent about Pierce or the email or the empty break room. She simply continued her work with the same meticulous attention she brought to every task. The colonel studied her for a long moment. I've been reading the same file for 40 years. I know what invisible looks like. Ashley did not respond. But her hand steadied on the medication cart. That night, after her shift ended at 11 p.m., Ashley stood alone in a locked supply closet on the 3rd floor. The one where nobody went after hours. The one where the broken overhead light had never been repaired and maintenance schedules always seemed to skip that particular inventory. She stood in the dark for exactly 2 minutes and let herself shake. Not from fear. Not from hurt. From the kind of controlled rage that comes from understanding you are being dismantled methodically by someone competent, someone with institutional authority, someone who understood that destroying a person quietly was far more effective than destroying them loudly. Her jaw trembled. Her hands shook at her sides. Her breathing came in controlled bursts, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the tactical breathing pattern drilled into her during selection and survival training. 2 minutes. That was her allocation. 2 minutes to process the fact that a man who was stealing hospital resources with industrial efficiency had decided she was a liability, had decided that her quiet observation of his criminal activity required her erasure, had decided that constructing a narrative of professional incompetence was more efficient than addressing the actual threat she represented. When 2 minutes had elapsed, Ashley stepped out of the supply closet. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her breathing had normalized. Her face showed nothing. She returned to the floor, clocked out, and walked to the parking lot where her 2008 Honda Civic waited under the Georgia heat. In room 447, Colonel Marcus Chen sat in the darkness, his cardiac monitor displaying its steady rhythm, his mind processing what he had observed. He had not survived 3 decades in command by missing the patterns. He had not reached the rank of colonel by failing to identify when someone was being systematically destroyed. And he had definitely not reached the rank of colonel without understanding that the person being destroyed in his presence was something far more dangerous than a nurse. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to consider what would happen when the truth surfaced. Because the truth always surfaced, eventually. In his experience, it just took the right kind of pressure. The right kind of crisis. The right moment when masks came off and people showed you exactly what they were. He would not have long to wait. The right moment came at 2:17 a.m. The ICU's double doors exploded inward like someone had kicked them from the hinges. A man, 7 feet, maybe more, shoulders filling the frame like a linebacker, stormed through wearing a stained denim jacket, his eyes the wild blue of someone running on empty veins and desperation. The hunting knife in his right hand caught the fluorescent lights and threw them back like a warning. Narcotics! Now! His voice came out ragged, broken glass wrapped in gravel. Don't make me ask twice. The night shift froze. 3 nurses at the station. 1 resident reading labs on a computer. 2 orderlies processing intake paperwork. Everyone understood the calculus instantly. A 7-foot man with a knife and nothing left to lose was not a situation that resolved with protocol. The younger orderly, Marcus Webb, 24, Army Reserves, the kind of kid who smiled at everyone, had the misfortune of standing closest to the medication cart. The intruder grabbed him by the throat, lifting him slightly off his feet. Webb's eyes went wide. The knife came up until the blade was 3 inches from his jaw. Keys to the cabinet. Don't test me. The intruder's hand trembled, but not from fear. From need. The trembling of someone whose body was screaming for what only the locked cabinet could provide. Webb made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Security was being called. Someone had already hit the panic button. Ashley saw the red light blinking on the wall unit. Response time from the lobby was for minutes if the guards were alert, 7 if they weren't. Webb didn't have 7 minutes. The knife was steady now, the man's arm locked with the kind of strength that comes from amphetamine-fueled panic. Ashley didn't think. That was the critical part later, she didn't think. Muscle memory was not thought. Muscle memory was what 8 years in the Hindu Kush had burned into the neural pathways at a level that bypassed the conscious mind entirely. She moved. The first technique was a controlled strike to the intruder's radial nerve, the inside of his wrist, the kind of strike that made fingers open involuntarily. He gasped. The knife fell. Her hand caught it by the spine before it clattered to the tile. The second movement was a pivot, using his own momentum against him, his balance disrupted as she rotated beneath his arm. His grip on Webb loosened. Webb stumbled backward. The third was a pressure point on the brachial plexus, the nerve cluster in his shoulder, the kind of technique that specialized forces learned for situations exactly like this. The man dropped to one knee. The fourth was simple. She placed the knife on the counter behind her and stepped back, her hands raised and visible, her breathing steady and controlled, her expression absolutely blank. It took for seconds. Maybe 5. Security hadn't even reached the ICU stairs yet. The intruder collapsed fully, gasping, his body suddenly recognizing that the threat had ended before his brain could process it. Webb stood against the wall, hand on his throat, staring at Ashley with the expression of someone who had just watched gravity reverse itself. The room remained perfectly silent for 3 long breaths. Then the red panic light stopped blinking, the security team had acknowledged the alert, and the spell broke. One of the nurses made a small noise. Another reached for the phone to call for police, though security would already be handling it. Ashley turned away and began checking full lines on the nearest patient. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was steady. The past 8 years of invisibility had purchased something valuable, the ability to suppress the adrenaline response, to compartmentalize what had just happened into a locked box that wouldn't open until she was alone. Webb was still staring. "Thank you," he said quietly. Then, softer, "How did you?" "Training." Ashley didn't look at him. "From before." That was all she would give them. That was all she could give them. Security arrived 90 seconds later. They took the intruder, who was still gasping and shaking, down to holding. They took statements. They asked Ashley if she wanted to file a report, if she wanted medical evaluation, if she was okay. She said yes to the report, no to the other 2. She was fine. Everything was fine. She returned to her rounds as if nothing had shifted, as if the world hadn't just watched the invisible nurse become suddenly, impossibly visible. But something had shifted. Ashley felt it in the way the nurses looked at her now. Not with the cold distance of before, when Dr. Pierce's carefully worded warnings had made her radioactive. This was different. This was the look of people who had just witnessed something that didn't fit the narrative they'd been given about who she was. By the time Dr. Pierce arrived at 2:33 a.m., summoned by the security alert, still wearing his expensive coat from wherever he'd been, the story was already being told and retold. 3 nurses clustered around the station, their voices low and urgent, replaying the encounter frame by frame. Webb was showing them the bruises forming on his neck. Someone mentioned that Ashley had moved faster than seemed possible. Someone else used the phrase, careful and quiet, military training. Dr. Pierce stopped in the doorway and listened. He was good at listening. He'd built an embezzlement scheme worth $847,000 by listening to what people didn't say, understanding what gaps in procedure could be filled, recognizing which conversations were safe and which weren't. He listened now and heard the subtext beneath every word. He heard, Captain. He heard, combat. He heard, not what she appears. His careful calculations suddenly needed revision. For 2 years, he'd considered Ashley Cooper a minor irritant, an invisible floor nurse who asked uncomfortable questions about supply orders, who had seen something in the accounting that made her pause in the hallway, that made her eyes flicker with the kind of recognition that meant she understood the problem. He designed her elimination from the hospital with the precision of someone who understood institutional leverage. The public humiliation had worked. The isolation had worked. She was scheduled to break within a month, quit or collapse, either way she'd be gone, and whatever she suspected would leave with her. But he'd miscalculated the variable. She wasn't invisible because she was weak. She was invisible because she was hiding. The implication spiraled through his mind like thrown dice. A woman with that kind of combat capability, that kind of speed, that kind of muscle memory, she wasn't a floor nurse. She was something he didn't yet have enough information to name, but something trained, something dangerous, something with the kind of skills that didn't appear on a public resume. Ashley continued her medication rounds, aware now of his presence in the doorway, aware of his eyes tracking her, aware that his careful assessment had shifted into something different. Calculation was still there, but now it included a new variable or fear. He stayed for 7 minutes. Watched her work. Noted how her hands moved with absolute precision, how she didn't acknowledge his presence, how her silence was no longer submissive but controlled, the silence of someone who was choosing not to speak rather than someone who was afraid to. When he left, it was with a phone already at his ear, already dialing, already shifting from social attacks to something more strategic. Within 2 hours, the 3 nurses who had witnessed the incident would receive calls from HR moving them to the night shift on different units. Within 4 hours, his contact in IT would receive a request to review the security footage timestamps. Dr. Pierce always covered his access, always made sure the digital trail was clean. But what he didn't know was that Marcus Webb, the orderly Ashley had saved, the 24-year-old Army Reserve, had already uploaded every frame to a secure encrypted drive before the security team even arrived. Webb's father had been Delta. Webb understood that some people didn't record things for the record, they recorded them because they'd learned to always have a backup plan. The sun was rising over Atlanta when HR summoned Ashley to the administrative wing. The office smelled like expensive leather and filtered coffee, the kind of professional calm that had been purchased with money and maintained by people who never experienced consequences. The HR director sat across from her, looking sympathetic. Dr. Pierce sat beside her, his expression carefully composed into something that approximated concern. "We appreciate what you did tonight, Nurse Cooper," the HR director began. "Your instincts were quick. But this hospital has policies about physical intervention, about scope of practice, about liability. I stopped an armed attacker from killing an employee," Ashley said. Her voice had changed. The director noticed it. Dr. Pierce noticed it more, heard the flat certainty beneath the words, the tone of someone reporting a fact, not defending a position. Pierce slid a manila envelope across the desk. "We have a termination letter prepared. Effective immediately. Your final paycheck will include payment through the end of this pay period. Security will escort you to retrieve your personal items." Ashley opened the envelope. The letter was dated 5:27 a.m. The charges listed were excessive force and unauthorized physical intervention creating patient safety and liability concerns. The language was precise and institutional and protected them completely. She'd seen similar documents in her previous life, language designed to stand up in court, language that transformed an act of heroism into an act of misconduct. She read it once. Nodded once. Stood once. "I understand," she said. No argument. No defense. No indication that she would fight this. 8 years ago, naval intelligence had given her specific orders: disappear, remain invisible, never surface, never draw attention to what you are or what you've done. Those orders still stood. Breaking them meant phones being answered on secure lines that she wasn't supposed to know about, meant paperwork being filed in offices that didn't appear on any official directory, meant consequences that reached far beyond a hospital termination letter. She walked to her locker, placed the folded flag of her fallen teammate into a cardboard box alongside a cracked coffee mug and a photograph of 8 faces, her team from the Hindu Kush, 3 of them still alive, 1 of them her. Security watched her leave. The nurses pretended not to notice. Dr. Pierce watched from his office doorway upstairs, already calculating what this meant, already understanding that he'd made a critical error in his assessment. That was the thing about invisible people. When you finally made them visible, you couldn't control what they revealed. Within 6 hours, Dr. Pierce moved like a chess player who'd seen his endgame crumble. The 3 nurses who witnessed the ICU incident, Garcia, Morrison, and Chen, received reassignment notices stapled to their paychecks. Garcia transferred to pediatrics on the 3rd floor. Morrison got the graveyard shift in orthopedics. Chen moved to outpatient surgery, her schedule inverted, her testimony scattered across different wings of Cedar Creek Medical. No consistent account. No unified story. Just 3 separate nurses who could no longer corroborate what they'd seen. Pierce understood institutional power the way a surgeon understands anatomy. He'd spent 14 years weaponizing it. The security footage was next. In the IT basement at 11:51 p.m., Pierce stood beside Marcus Webb's replacement, a temporary contractor named Patterson who owed Pierce a favor from a medical records auditing job 3 years prior, and watched timestamps get edited. The incident that occurred at 2:17 a.m. was now listed as 2:34 a.m. The intruder's arrival shifted by 17 minutes. The disarming sequence compressed. The footage didn't lie, exactly, but it became fragmented, questionable, ripe for interpretation. A good lawyer could argue about the timeline. A jury could doubt what they saw. By morning, Pierce had called in 3 board members. Not the full board, that would leave a paper trail. Just 3. The chief administrator, the hospital's attorney, and the CFO who'd benefited from Pierce's efficiency initiatives in surgical supply ordering. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he'd never admit it, he was using his own embezzlement network to bury her. At 7:23 a.m., Pierce sat in a conference room with mahogany paneling and presented his case. He had the fabricated write-up from the bulletin board. He had 7 months of documented concerns that he'd compiled retroactively, pulling performance reviews from files and adding margin notes about questionable judgment and possible insubordination. He had the altered security footage queued to the timestamps that made Ashley's intervention look less like heroism and more like unnecessary escalation. Excessive force, Pierce said, his voice smooth as anesthesia. Patient endangerment. A pattern of recklessness. We have liability exposure here, gentlemen. Significant exposure. The hospital attorney, a woman named Rothstein who'd never actually witnessed anything and relied entirely on Pierce's narrative, nodded slowly. The liability's real. 1 lawsuit from the intruder's family. Not to mention the orderly, Pierce continued. She could have waited for security. Instead, she engaged a violent suspect in close quarters. What if he'd had a gun? What if she'd been shot and died on our premises? What if she'd been killed and the hospital's security protocols were deemed negligent? The CFO didn't care about protocols. He cared about his quarterly numbers. How fast can we process the termination? Before the end of shift, Pierce said. I'll handle the conversation personally. Professional. Respectful. She'll sign the severance, agree to a non-disclosure, and we close the book. The chief administrator, an older man who'd learned long ago that career advancement meant not asking difficult questions, smiled thinly. Get it done, doctor. By 3:17 p.m., Ashley stood at a bus stop on Peach Street, rain hammering the shelter with the sound of distant artillery. The cardboard box balanced on her hip contained exactly 3 things. A ceramic coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" with a chip along the rim. A dying succulent in a crack pot that she'd somehow kept forgetting to water for 8 months. And a photograph. 8 faces in that photograph. Soldiers in the Hindu Kush, dust coating their body armor, eyes reflecting the kind of clarity that only comes from having survived something that kills most people. 3 still alive. One of them was her, 23 years old, before the scar on her left shoulder blade, before the phantom pain in her right leg, before naval intelligence ordered her records deleted and her existence officially terminated. The rain mixed with something else on her face. Tears. She wasn't crying because she'd been fired. She wasn't crying because Dr. Pierce had orchestrated her destruction with the precision of a surgeon excising a tumor. She was crying because of the letter in her other pocket, the one that arrived that morning with a postmark from Qatar. Her son David's handwriting. His words, "Colonel Chen says you're the best nurse he's ever had. Proud of you, Mom." The bus roared past without stopping. Red taillights bled into the puddles like watercolor paint. The broken streetlight overhead flickered and hummed. She watched the bus disappear around a corner and shifted the box's weight. A woman with a stroller asked if she was all right. "Fine," Ashley said. "Just waiting." The next bus wouldn't come for 18 minutes. She walked instead. Cedar Creek Medical's trauma bay received an emergency call at 5:41 p.m. Highway accident near the junction of I-85 and IE-285. Multiple vehicles. State Department contractor, unconscious, no identification. ETA for minutes. The attending on call was Dr. Harrison, competent but not exceptional. The resident was a third-year named Gupta who moved with the hesitation of someone still learning to trust their hands. When the patient arrived, a man in his 50s with massive blunt force trauma to the chest and a Glasgow coma scale of 6, Harrison ordered the standard protocols. 2 large-bore 4s. Rapid fluid resuscitation. Chest imaging. The patient crashed during the CT scan. Cardiac arrest. Asystole. They called for additional staff. The code team assembled. Chest compressions. Epinephrine 1 mg 4-push. Defibrillation attempts. The monitor showed flat line, unwavering, absolute. Colonel Chen, now recovering in the orthopedic unit and frustrated with his restricted mobility, heard the code announced overhead. He heard the trauma bay designation. He sat up despite the pain in his fractured ribs and made a decision that his military training had taught him 30 years ago. Sometimes you request specific resources. He called the charge nurse. Asked if Captain Cooper was working. "No, sir," the nurse said. "She left hours ago." Chen asked for her cell number. Said it was medical related. Said it was important. The charge nurse knew Colonel Chen's authority. She gave the number. At 5:51 p.m., Ashley's phone buzzed while she stood under an awning on Auburn Avenue, the rain still falling, her uniform still soaked, her body finally slowing down from the adrenaline of humiliation and loss. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Captain Cooper," a voice said. Not Chen himself, his voice was strained with pain, but a younger officer speaking from his phone. "We need you at Cedar Creek. Trauma code. Critical." She could have said no. She could have said she'd been terminated. She could have pointed out that she had no authorization, no liability coverage, no employment. A code was a code. That was the part of military training they never taught you to unlearn. The part that lived in muscle memory and blood cells and the architecture of who you were. She left the box under the awning. the succulent would survive. The mug didn't matter. The photograph didn't need her. She ran back to Cedar Creek Medical. The trauma bay doors swung open and Ashley moved like something being pulled by gravity, like a force of nature that didn't recognize the concept of surrender. Dr. Harrison saw her and started to object. "Who are you? Where's your ID?" But she was already gloved, already assessing. The patient had been in arrest for 4 minutes. No response to drugs. No response to electricity. The monitor showed the kind of flatness that usually meant goodbye. "Status," Ashley said. "Dead," Harrison said. "We've been coding for 4 minutes. There's no 14-gauge needle," Ashley interrupted. "Betadine. Now." She positioned herself at the patient's left anterior thoracic wall, between the 4th and 5th intercostal spaces, her hands moving with the terrible precision of someone who'd done this in field conditions under fire. The needle went in. Blood returned. She had access to the pericardium. She asked for a scalpel. Harrison tried to redirect, but Gupta, the third-year resident, recognized something in Ashley's movements that transcended rank or protocol. Pure expertise. The incision was clean. No hesitation. Skin, fascia, muscle, each layer parted like a door she'd learned to open years ago. She reached into the thoracic cavity with her hand, found the heart, felt its stillness, and began manual cardiac massage. Her fingers were inside the patient's chest, pumping his heart because his heart had forgotten how to pump itself. 1 minute. 2 minutes. The monitor still flat line. 3 minutes. Suddenly a flutter. 4 minutes. A rhythm. Weak. Chaotic. But alive. O2 saturation climbed from 62 to 71 to 82. Blood pressure registered 58/34. They needed blood. They needed to move. They needed surgery. "Operating room now," Ashley said. "Call ahead. Thoracic surgery. Tell them open cardiac wound. Tell them they're getting a patient who won't die." It wasn't a question. It was a command shaped by 8 years of military medicine and the kind of authority that comes from having pulled 14 patients back from the absolute threshold of death. Harrison and Gupta moved like she'd physically rewritten their understanding of possible. The patient survived the transfer. Made it to surgery. The thoracic surgeon, Dr. Winters, found the right ventricle laceration from a rib fragment, repaired it with 4 sutures, and told the operating room staff he'd never seen someone perform emergency thoracotomy with such precision outside a military surgical theater. They got pulses back. Stable pulses. By 10:34 p.m., the patient was sedated in the ICU, tubes threaded through his airway, machines breathing for him, machines monitoring every electrical impulse his damaged heart still possessed. 3 hours later, the sedation wore off. The patient's eyes moved. His fingers twitched. Ashley checked his pupils. Responsive. She assessed his neurological status, documented the findings, and as she reached for his wrist to check the radial pulse, his eyes focused on her face. He went rigid. Became someone else entirely. "Phantom," he whispered in Pashto. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breath. The monitor continued its steady beeping, sinus rhythm, beautiful and normal and completely insufficient for the silence that swallowed the ICU. Ashley's hands trembled. After 8 years, her hands finally trembled. Not from fear. From the kind of recognition that means you've been found. The patient's eyes didn't waver. Neither did hers. "Phantom," he said again. "You carried me 6 kilometers. 3 days later, Marcus Webb sat in the server room with the hum of processors surrounding him like a choir, pulling backup files from a secure drive he'd hidden the moment he watched Ashley disarm that man with a knife. He was Army intelligence once, spent 3 years at Fort Meade learning how to follow digital breadcrumbs. The security footage from 2:17 a.m. was intact, unaltered, every second preserved in crystal clarity. But it wasn't just the knife attack that made his hands shake as he compiled the files. It was the procurement records. The supply contract discrepancies. The same irregularities Ashley had flagged months ago that cost her a job. Marcus had noticed them too and spent 6 months learning forensic accounting through night courses. He burned everything to a secure drive and at 4:33 p.m., he sent it to the FBI field office in downtown Atlanta with documentation spanning 3 years of inflated surgical equipment invoices, shell company payments, and kickback schemes that totaled $340,000. The email had a single line, subject, Cedar Creek Medical, procurement fraud, federal violation, witness tampering. His name never appeared. But that wasn't the worst part. At the same moment Marcus Webb was uploading evidence, room for 47 received a trauma admission. 28-year-old male, motor vehicle accident on I-85, unconscious on arrival, massive head trauma, transported by paramedics at 4:17 p.m. They wheeled him into the ICU, intubated him, started continuous monitoring. Ashley was checking his vitals at 4:52 p.m. when his eyes opened. Just a flutter at first. Then a full awakening. His gaze moved across the ceiling, found the monitor, then found her face. His pupils dilated. His body tensed against the restraints. "You," he whispered in Pashto. The word came out fractured, barely intelligible through the pain. "Phantom." The room went dead silent. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The monitor beeped. A nurse's shoe squeaked on the tile floor somewhere in the hallway. But inside room for 47, the silence was so thick you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electric prayer. Ashley's hands didn't move. Her expression didn't change. But something shifted in her chest, some wall that had held for 18 months crumbling like mortar. "Remain still," she said, and her voice had dropped an octave. Not a request. A command. The patient, a Marine Corps liaison named Captain Chen, no relation to Colonel Chen in 447, but assigned to the hospital's visitor rotation through the VA, had served in Sanjin Valley when Ashley led Operation Sandstorm. He was a Black Hawk pilot then. He'd pulled her out twice. And now he was conscious enough to recognize her despite the intubation tube, despite the pain, despite the 18 months that had supposedly erased her from existence. A doctor rushed in. 2 nurses followed. And then Captain Rodriguez, the Marine Corps liaison stationed at Cedar Creek as a visitor advocate, stepped through the doorway because he'd been visiting a patient 2 rooms over and heard the commotion. He was 63, carry the weight of someone who'd made major decisions in combat zones, and his eyes narrowed as he looked at Ashley Cooper standing perfectly still beside that bed. "What's going on here?" he asked. The patient in the bed spoke again, clearer this time despite the pain. "That's Captain Cooper." "That's Phantom." The words hung in the air like a grenade someone had pulled the pin from but hadn't released yet. Rodriguez's eyes moved to Ashley's face. Then slowly down to her hospital ID badge. Then back to her eyes. He was a career Marine with security clearance and a photographic memory for rank insignia. Something clicked behind his expression. He turned and walked into the hallway. Came back 10 minutes later with a laptop. Sat down at the nurse's station without asking permission. "Talk to me," he said to no one in particular. "What's the story with your floor nurse?" The nurse who'd been standing near Ashley couldn't articulate anything useful because she didn't know the story. So Rodriguez did what a Marine Corps liaison with access to classified channels does when someone mentions a battlefield call sign. He pulled Ashley's military file. His eyes moved across the screen. Reading. Processing. Then he turned his laptop toward the patient in room for 47 and began reading aloud, his voice carrying the weight of official military documentation, Captain Ashley Marie Cooper. Special Forces Command. Silver Star. He paused, looked at Ashley, continued. 2 bronze stars with Valor. Another pause. His jaw tightened slightly. 2 purple hearts. He turned the laptop back toward himself, reading further, then looked up. Credited with 17 combat saves. Led Operation Sandstorm under classified authority. Decorated combat medic. Promoted to captain. Then, he scrolled, his finger stopping on a line that made his entire body go still. Then all records redacted. Classified level top secret SCI medical discharge issued under Pentagon authority. Current status, inactive reserve pending naval intelligence review. The room had filled with staff by then. 2 doctors, 3 nurses, a respiratory therapist standing against the wall with her arms crossed, trying to piece together what was happening. One of them whispered something to another. The whisper spread like contagion. That was when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway. He'd been in his office when he heard the commotion. He'd emerged to find his floor nurse standing in the middle of an ICU room being read her military credentials by a Marine Corps officer. His face went a color that wasn't found in nature. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "What is this?" His voice came out thin. "This woman is a terminated employee. She needs to leave this floor immediately." Rodriguez turned slowly in his chair. His eyes tracked Dr. Pierce with the precision of a combat veteran assessing a threat. When he spoke, his voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Dr. Pierce, I have a problem understanding why a decorated combat officer was terminated for stopping a violent attack in your facility 3 days ago." He turned back to the laptop. Continued reading as if Pierce had never spoken. Operation Sandstorm involved coordinated direct action in Hindu Kush Mountains with elements from 75th Ranger Regiment and JSOC Task Force 121. Leadership commendations note extraordinary medical intervention under active fire. Rodriguez paused. Looked up at Pierce. That sounds like the opposite of incompetence. Dr. Pierce's face went a shade darker. His hands clenched. He opened his mouth to speak but nothing came out because at that exact moment, his phone rang. He looked at the caller ID and the color drained from his face entirely. 2 federal agents were in the hospital lobby. They wanted to speak with him about procurement records. Now. He didn't go to the lobby. He didn't answer the phone. Instead, he walked back to his office, locked the door, and opened his computer to check the hospital security system. His hands shook as he logged in. Navigated to the backup files from the ICU incident. The 2:17 a.m. footage. The intruder with the knife. The disarming. All of it. The folder was empty. In its place was a single text file with 2 words, backupsecure.mw. Marcus Webb. Dr. Pierce tried calling his contact at the surgical supply company. The line went straight to voicemail. He tried logging into his shell company accounts. They'd been frozen by federal order. He tried calling 3 board members. 2 didn't answer. The 3rd said, "Dr. Pierce, the FBI is here asking questions about your procurement oversight. Don't call me again." At 6:15 p.m., 2 federal agents in dark suits appeared at his office door with a warrant. At 7:08 p.m., the hospital board voted unanimously to place him on administrative leave pending investigation. At 9:38 p.m., Dr. Pierce sat in a federal holding facility answering questions about $340,000 in fraudulent kickbacks while Captain Rodriguez sat in a conference room with Ashley Cooper, Colonel Chen, and a JAG officer who explained that her naval intelligence orders to disappear had been classified back in 2021, which meant those orders expired for years ago. She'd been hiding from ghosts. "We owe you an apology, Captain," the JAG officer said. His name was Commander Walsh. His voice carried genuine respect. "And a restoration of your career." "I don't want my old position back," Ashley said. Her voice was quiet. Measured. The voice of someone who'd spent 18 months learning to disappear and 18 minutes learning she didn't have to anymore. "I want Director of Emergency Medicine." The board members exchanged looks. Colonel Chen smiled slightly. Commander Walsh nodded once. "You'll have it," he said. The rain had stopped by the time Ashley left Cedar Creek Medical that night. The parking lot was slick with water that reflected the neon lights of the city like a mirror nobody had asked for. She walked to her car, the same car that had carried her to a bus stop 3 days earlier, and sat in the driver's seat without turning on the engine. She pulled out her phone, opened a message thread with her son. 3 months of unanswered texts. She typed, "I'm staying in Atlanta. Position just changed. Call when you can. I love you." 3 seconds later, her phone rang. His voice came through like radio static. "Mom? What happened?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel. Hands that had held a knife against a man's throat. Hands that had performed emergency medicine under fire. Hands that had been invisible for so long they'd almost forgotten how to be seen. "Everything," she finally said. "Everything happened." If you've made it this far, you're someone who believes that the quietest people often carry the loudest stories. Subscribe to see what Ashley does next. Like this video if you think she deserved better from the start. And comment, would you have walked away that night at the bus stop, or would you have fought back? Let me know.